If Western democratic countries once were accused of hubris as they claimed victory for democracy in the post-Cold War era, today such outspoken fervor and the impulse to export democracy, well, it's now greatly diminished. With us now, as part of our joint TVO Toronto Star initiative, the Democracy Agenda, we welcome, in Waterloo, Ontario, Bessma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Centre for International Governance Innovation. And in the provincial capital, in Riverside, Chad Rogers, founding partner at the public affairs agency Crestview Strategy. On the Danforth, Lucan Way, Professor of Political Science at the U of T's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And in Midtown, there's Martin Regg, political columnist with the Toronto Star. And we welcome everybody back to our program. Martin, I got to say, we're really enjoying this initiative with the Star, so glad you could join us for this, our third episode of our Democracy Agenda. We want to just share with you and our viewers some numbers here off the top. The Economist magazine, they do an annual survey called the Democracy Index just to see who's moving closer towards the ideals of democracy, who's moving further away. Sheldon, if you would, let's put these numbers up and we'll share these with everybody here. Full-fledged, let's call them Canadian-style democracies, if you like. No question about the amount of democracy we have in Canada today. We are considered one of the world's stronger democracies, but that's only 8.4% of the people in this world who live under such conditions. In so-called flawed democracies, there's another 41% of the world's population. So-called hybrid regimes, 15%. And then at the bottom of the list, authoritarian regimes. These would be the ones the furthest away in this world from democracy, more than a third of the world's population living under those conditions. If you do the math, it's just about 50-50 on the nose between those living under some form of democracy and those who don't. Now, the average global score in the 2020 Democracy Index fell from 5.44 in 2019 to 5.37 in 2020. It's just a way of measuring, and it's by far the worst global score since the index was first produced in 2006. And again, I felt somewhat confident calling Canada a full democracy off the top. We came fifth on the Economist's scale. The United States, incidentally, 25th. Okay, lots of numbers there to chew over. Lucan, why don't you put that into some historical context for us off the top?
Well, a couple of things are interesting. One, it's important to note where this decline has occurred. Now, typically we would assume that the decline would be among newer democracies that are presumably less consolidated. But in fact, most of the decline has occurred among established democracies like the United States. And in fact, in the developing world, among newer democracies, the number of democracies in the last 10 or 15 years has remained remarkably stable. So that, you have democracy has survived in a number of places with, very inhospitable conditions, extreme poverty, weak institutions, ethnic polarization. And overall, there's only been a decline of about 5 or 6% in the last 10 or 15 years. And we are still very much in an era where there is more democracy now than there ever has been in world history. Maybe since 2006 it's been declined, but since 1972 there's been a dramatic increase, and the small decline that has occurred recently has not hit into that.
As I asked Bessma to follow up on that, I would say some days it doesn't feel that way. For example, countries move back and forth on this Economist Index. And India, for example, apparently less democratic over the past year. Taiwan, on the other hand, considered more democratic. What's your read on the state of democracy in the world today?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, look, it's been a 20-year process, maybe 15 to 20-year process where we're seeing not just the decline of democracy, but as the stats show, sort of a rise of authoritarianism in these hybrid regimes. The state of affairs is quite sad. Of course, coming out of the Trump era, I mean, we see it next door, this polarization, disinformation. There's a lot of blame, frankly, on information communication technology and social media. The digital authoritarianism of a lot of governments who are able to not just monitor their people, which is really, I think, quite perverse and quite worrying, but also to clamp down on their people, whether it's self-censorship or write-out censorship. And of course, media, which so many of you are so interested in, of course, is really taking a beating globally. And this is really quite sad. And of course, India is a great example of that. I mean, it has a history of a wonderful media that had historically been so, critical of government and powerful people, but it's been silenced under Modi. So it's really quite troubling.
Now, Chad, one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the program today is that you spend, if you want to call it, some of your spare time supporting pro-democracy movements in places like Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine. I do have to point out that the Russian president has said liberal democracy, as we understand it today, is quote unquote obsolete. When you see some of the results, the likes of which we've just presented, do you worry that he's right?
No, I'd expect nothing more from a thug who looks at the basics of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the core ingredients of free press, judiciary, free and fair, elections, right to assemble, as meaningless and secondary to his own interests. I had the pleasure of working for something called the National Democratic Institute for a number of years, where we'd go out and actually support democracy activists as they made the transition. And if there was one humbling thing as a Canadian going abroad and doing that work, it was how much of my own history I regarded democracy as a one-way turnstile, that it's something you earn once or you achieve once. And the humility about the weakness in our own system as you look at transitional democracies is remembering that democracy is imperfect and unfinished by design. And in Canada, the number I always take into account, and I use it, when I'm with friends and family, which is 1957. And it's not just the year that Diefenbaker wins a surprise federal election in Canada. It's the first time we let our fellow citizens, Indigenous citizens, participate in an election and vote. There is no perfection in democracy. It is a constant, slow revolution of making it better. So we can't conflate the constant effort to make democracies better when they stumble with the effort of being democratic or not.
Now, some people as well, Martin, are going to wonder, why are we having the Ontario politics correspondent for the Toronto Star on this program? But I think we only need to read your Twitter account description of yourself to understand that you are a self-described recovering foreign correspondent. You've traveled all over the world. You've lived in many places around the world. How do you explain what has come to be known as a bit of a democratic recession over the last 15 years?
Well, I think we have to question the premise, too. I agree with what Bessma and Chad were saying, and also Lucan, about how is the glass half full or half empty. And I think we have to remember that to use the economist terminology, flawed democracies, every democracy is flawed and is a work in progress. I think that was Chad's point. Certainly our own, certainly America's. They're not just flawed, it's also not a linear progression. And every democracy takes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Some, talk about a recession in democracy. And I think that's an apt term, because think of it as the business cycle. You have the pendulum swinging, you have an economic surge and a crash, and democracy works in much the same ways. Think of the election cycle. Democracy is not just elections, but the pendulum shows us that sometimes you have these unpleasant lurches towards authoritarian populism, and then you have corrections and corrective forces. So let's not get too down on the downturn. One other point, I think it was Lucan's point, one of the reasons we're having these setbacks is we had this incredible surge, this blossoming in democracy, starting with, not just starting, but epitomized by the fall of the Berlin Wall, and prosperity in East Asia, which gave us Taiwan and South Korean democracy, some of the most robust. So the fall of the Soviet Empire gave us democracy, embryonic democracy in Poland and Ukraine, Hungary. So all these countries that are having some setbacks in the last few years, like Hungary and Poland in particular, and I was just in Poland a few years ago, let's remember how far Poland and Hungary and Romania have come in the last 15 years. So there's going to be blowback, and then there's going to be recovery.
Well, as we look around the world, Lucan, we do have to say that even though there was a coup in Myanmar, there are people in the streets demonstrating against that. Even though Vladimir Putin tried to poison, well, I shouldn't say categorically, but it's certainly the evidence, the preponderance of evidence would suggest that he tried to take out his the leader of the opposition, Alexei Navalny, with poison. You've got people in the streets protesting on his behalf. You've got youth in Hong Kong showing remarkable attachment to the vestiges of democracy there. Even though democracy may be this year on a downward slant, is it fair to say, in your judgment, that it's still the desired model for governance in much of the world?
Absolutely. Look, in 1972, there were 3 times more autocracies than democracies. Now it's about even. And furthermore, despite the discreditation of the West, despite the fact that, in the 1990s, the West was wealth, prosperity, democracy, with the financial crisis that's gone out the window, but competitive elections remain incredibly popular. People may not abide by all elements of liberalism, tolerance and the like, but people like to be able to throw out bad governments in elections. So thus, as you said, there's been a wave of protests in support of democracy across the world: Algeria, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Russia, Belarus, you name it. Democracy remains very popular.
Now, as encouraging as that sounds, I'm going to bring one of our Middle East experts in here right now, in Bessma Momani, to talk about the fact that a decade ago, the Arab Spring sprung, and there was tremendous excitement and optimism in the air. And Bessma, I think you'd have to conclude a decade later, a lot of those dreams for a more democratic Middle East are simply dead. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think the desire is still there, but certainly in terms of government repression, able to, basically, clamp down and ensure that those democratic movements are no more is absolutely the case, and that's really unfortunate. But I think it really is, just as many of the colleagues on this panel are pointing out, there's a global challenge, and I think that means that we have to think about what are the structural features of this. Is it, as I said before, the increased use of the internet and having more social media platforms that are channeling us into these echo chambers and so hardening views. I think the structural economic issues is something that we should think about, whether it's the international financial crisis, inequality, right? This is something that I think is a real part of the threatening aspects of democracy being challenged, is the fact that people don't feel like things are getting better on the economic side. It really is part of what explained the rise of Donald Trump and so many of these populist authoritarians. So I think there are some sort of global structural features that explain why we're seeing this, and I don't think it's just the Middle East. Yeah,
Chad, democracy in some respects is a short form for liberal democracy, the respect for civil rights, free and fair elections, a judiciary, rule of law, and so on and so forth. I wonder if I could get you to speak to the issue about whether there are people around this world who are less offended at the democracy part of that equation and more offended at the notion that somehow they've got to do it, quote unquote, in a liberal way. Is that part of the problem here?
It's an extremely interesting question. I mean, what you're often confronted with in societies in transition is who wins and who loses. And there's often an entrenched elite who are very big winners, to whom small L liberalism is terrifying because it means they get less of what they're currently keeping for themselves. You look at the magic ingredients for when democracies work and have their blossoming moments. It's not just a great protest or one singular election. It is, are there nascent institutions that have the basis to build and enforce those big 5 norms we talk about in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, shepherded by a New Brunswicker of all people, Dr. John Humphreys. There's the second side of the triangle, which is civil society. Do we have community, religious, other social structures outside of the state that can aggregate public opinion? And then do we have the political actors who are free to speak and engage and aggregate social opinion? And when we have these false starts, pure democracy versus the liberal tinge of it, there's a moment in the last few years, as we've talked about the rise of populism and political correctness and all of the debates we're having about social change and broadening the franchise. And I think it's a stolen quote, or it's falsely attributed to Thoreau, which is, if you hold 99% of the power and you lose 1%, that feels like oppression to you. Remember that at these big democratic moments, there are people who lose a lot instantly as you broaden the franchise. And sometimes it's an elite being deposed in Romania and then hung out the windows. How about in North America, when we have a whole bunch of people joining a debate right now because they have social media tools who some of us regard as uninformed? But that's always been the debate when we make the franchise bigger. Some people feel like they're losing a little bit of what they used to be the gatekeeper of.
Martin, I wonder if I could get you to amplify on that from this standpoint. There are places in this world which have fewer objections to the notion of free and fair elections, that part of the democratic equation. But they're not going to give up the notion of religion having an absolutely central part of the story of their country and in the daily life of their country. They are not signing on for gay rights in that that kind of thing. These are the parts of the equation they're not going to be a part of, and yet they still want to be thought of as democracies. Discuss.
Well, absolutely. I spent 11 years abroad, and most of that time was actually covering not so much conflict, but faith and religion and faith and politics. If you want a refresher course on the importance of that and how connected they are, think of our friends to the south. For better or for worse, faith and religion are huge parts of American politics, certainly the anti-abortion drive with the Republican Party. But remember, if you think about the setbacks, let's say in Poland right now, a lot of people are focusing on the loss of abortion rights. I couldn't be more pro-choice, but I understand that that's not necessarily an indicator of pure democracy, because look at Ireland. We think of Ireland as a robust democracy, but they banned abortion for decades. Italy took its time. So you can't pick and choose. Democracy is a process, and it doesn't have one particular look. There are many democracies in Africa and the Caribbean, some of which are quite healthy, which are very retrograde on gay rights. So you can't necessarily pick and cherry pick which are the problem areas. You mentioned the Middle East a moment ago. I spent 4 years living in the Middle East, and I've just been to Iran and Egypt, Lebanon in the last 3 or 4 years. These are countries that are hurting in every way, but certainly democratically. Egypt, Lebanon has a kind of democracy, a phantom democracy, but it is hijacked by various factions, religion playing a huge part there. But here's the point I want to make. People in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, who have not had an election since 2005, 15 years ago, despite purporting to be democratic, they are inspired by a model, not necessarily the optimal model, but perhaps inspiration is a wrong word that will offend some people, but they see democracy in action every day next door on their television screens in Israel. Israel is an occupying force about whom they are deeply, to whom they feel great antipathy and everything else. But one of the reasons they want democracy is that they have been exposed to it every day in Israel, where they have 2 or 3 elections a year in a bad year. So people want democracies. Chinese on the mainland see what's happening in Taiwan, and they want democracy. One of the reasons they're snuffing out democracy in Hong Kong is the fear that it will be a virus that is a contagion in the mainland. So there is still that desire to look for models. The models can be flawed, as it is in America. People can still aspire for the process of democracy with all the good, the bad, and the ugly.
You mentioned America, and I want to pick up there with Lucan. There's a new team in the Oval Office now, Lucan, and well, they're different from the old team. The old team didn't seem to have too much of a problem with increasing authoritarianism in various parts of the world. I wonder whether you think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris intend to be more robust in their pursuit of a more liberal international order.
Well, it wouldn't be hard, given the fact that you had a president who actively embraced autocrats and favored them over democratic leaders. And I think there will definitely, especially in terms of rhetoric, be a shift in terms of actively trying to promote democracy in various countries. But there are clear limits. I mean, there's obviously a lot of stuff on Biden's plate, global warming, obviously COVID, that require him to work with autocrats. So I wouldn't be I wouldn't be too optimistic in terms of how far he's willing to go. But I do think this change in rhetoric, can have a huge impact on the margins.
Bessma, how about you on that same question?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, certainly we've seen a total change in rhetoric coming out of the White House. And I think Biden's going to be a more introverted president. I don't think you're going to get a lot, despite the rhetoric that we've seen already and some very good kind of signs to rejoin the multilateral framework. I don't think you're going to get a very active president. And frankly, I think, this is not a time to be talking about sort of fixing the world when they need to fix what's happening at home. The United States is broken. It's polarized. You have racial challenges all day, the inequity, economic disparities, talking about trying to find a new path forward for economic growth. I mean, there are so many challenges at home for Biden to fix. I just don't think they have the the moral high ground to sort of be talking about trying to fix the world. So it's going to be an introverted presidency, and that's a good thing because they've got a lot to do at home. And at the same time, frankly, globally, their past record, when you talk about democracy promotion, you can't help but George Bush and sort of what he did with Iraq to think that, somehow they're in a position to spread this wonderful thing. They just don't hold the mantle anymore. And I don't think there's an appetite for it globally to hear from the United States leader that they're going to come with this great, concept of democracy. It's just not the same world that we had, 20 years ago.
Well, Chad, let me follow up with you from this angle. Even though the United States, as everybody here has said, was not a perfect practitioner of democracy, let's say 25, let's say 50 years ago, I think there was less doubt than there is today about what the idea of America represented in the world, and that if at least it paid lip service to the export of democracy, it became incumbent upon those who didn't want democracy and who wanted to treat their populations worse, that they might have to watch out for what the U.S. intended to do about that. Do you think the Biden administration wants to get back to a time where that kind of thinking was prevalent in the world?
Absolutely. The United States, for any of its failings, Yuval Levin has a great book called Fractured Republic I'd recommend, and he has a beautiful opening paragraph, and I'm going to steal a line from it where he says, when we talk about these great successes and failures, we forget they're often happening at the same time. And he summarizes it by saying, in democracies in countries like ours, renewal chases ruin. When the United States fails, it dramatically improves immediately after. That speaks to how functional it is as a democracy. And yes, Iraq as a war was folly with an incredible cost, but Iraq today has a parliament. Iraq today doesn't have a totalitarian dictator who enslaves 1/3 of his country and tortures those who disagree with him. That doesn't exist. They have a multi-partisan system. It is not perfect. It is in transition, but it is better than what preceded it. And the United States consistently puts the greatest share of its GDP of any Western nation on the earth on the table to enforce democracy and other institutions like free judiciaries and free media and others. I had the opportunity when I worked for the National Democratic Institute to serve a woman who used to be Secretary of State named Madeleine Albright and work with 3,000 colleagues in 60 countries around the world. We had a sister institute headed by the late John McCain. They did the same. So for all of the failings of the United States, where they are not always the best example, they certainly put more money on the table and more capital in helping those who want better democracy, better judiciary, better media, more freedom around the world than any other nation. So they'll be the leaders of the debate so long as they're the people financing it to the greatest extent.
Martin, I know everybody looks to the United States first when it comes to leadership on what we're talking about tonight. But Canada likes to think of itself as having a role to play as well. Do we? And if we do, what is it?
Yeah, we have a role, but we can't exaggerate it. I could give a pep talk about Canadian models. Bob Rae, someone we both know, founded and ran for many years the Forum of the Federations, which tried to share the wisdom and the bruises that we had from our own federalist adventures in countries like Sri Lanka, for example. But it didn't take, and in fact, Sri Lanka deported Bob Rae on the last time he tried to go there, our UN ambassador. So we are a model. When I've traveled to countries from around the world, people have looked at us as a model of multiculturalism, our immigration model, and so on. But we're at the margins. There are other countries that are also models: Sweden, Norway, the Scandinavian countries. But here's the thing, including with American exceptionalism, and I happen to agree with Chad that America, for all its warts, can still be a model by virtue of its scale and its presence. And just because they screwed up doesn't mean it can't, as I argued earlier, doesn't mean it still can't be a model. I mean, smart people understand that democracies are always having crazy zigzags. That doesn't mean you go for the consistency of authoritarianism that you see in China today. It means you have the hullabaloo. But the thing about Canadian and other countries being models is you can't ever export one particular model to any country. I know this sounds perhaps obvious or cliche, but every country is so different. None of it, it's about your social character and your historical development and your economic prosperity. And when you try to graft a particular model onto Uganda or Iraq or Gaza or any other country, you're going to have problems. I mean, the Swedish democracy works for Sweden. And no matter how hard the Toronto Star tried for decades to try to bring the Swedish model to Canada, and Ed Broadbent tried to bring the Swedish model of social democratic union, unions and management, and the German model, Canada's Canada. We like to be frisky sometimes. We have all our different fights, our social makeup. So that's a mistake. That doesn't mean you can't do God's work, as Chad did for the National Democratic Institute, and try to export the process of democracy, the ugly stuff of organizing and fundraising, because otherwise all these well-meaning Democrats in Egypt and Iraq don't have any power bases. They're up against the mullahs or against the army, and they can't compete. So you need to build it from the ground up. These countries all have shallow roots. All I'm saying is, yes, you can be a model, but no, you can't graft it somewhere else.
Well, you mentioned Bob Rae in that answer, and we actually have a piece of tape we want to play now from Bob Rae's University of Toronto roommate. Everybody remembers who that was, right? Here's the former leader of the Federal Liberal Party, Michael Ignatieff. Roll it, please, Sheldon.
There's a deeper crisis in the liberal confidence in the very stories we tell about our past. In this story, we tell the story that it was technology, that lifted the burden of labor off the backs of men and women. It was medical science that enabled women to face childbirth without terror. It was science that gave us the prospect that everyone could be born, grow up, and live a normal life, that freed millions and then billions from starvation and hunger. This is the Enlightenment story, the wonderful story that we inherit from Bacon, from Newton, from Adam Smith onwards, the empowering relationship between knowledge and freedom. And this is what liberated mankind from servitude, hunger, disease, and premature death. And frankly, it's the only good story left.
The only good story left. Okay, Michael Ignatieff from a speech he gave. In our remaining few moments here, let me get everybody quickly in on this last one, because I'd like to hear from all of you. Do we in the West still believe? Do we still believe enough in the values of freedom of speech and social progress and civil rights and a clean judiciary and free and fair elections to want to export these ideas around the world? Lucan, go.
Well, I think, in some ways you could say, well, the United States has been discredited by the recent election. But I think what this does is it tells us and the world how important these basic, democratic processes are. And, I really don't think we should clump all forms of democracy promotion together just because, things went disastrously in Iraq does not mean that we cannot use other means to promote democracy in the world. Simple naming and shaming, has worked wonders in preventing democratic reversals in places as diverse as Georgia, Ukraine, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Serbia, and the like. And I think that's something that the Biden administration is in a perfect position to do. So, and this doesn't require an investment of a large number of resources, but it still means we can be quite successful in turning the tide in a number of cases.
Bessma, do we still believe?
We do, and let's not forget the world still believes, because migration is coming to the West. It's coming to democracy. So, I'm obviously not just a great proponent of democracy. I do believe that we embody it more than anywhere else in the world, and people want it. That's fundamental. But frankly, we can be hypocritical about it, all countries. And that's partly because globalization has made us so dependent on every country. Look at what we're doing today with China, not being able to really stand firm against what may be the genocide against the Uyghur people because of how important it is. France, it talks a big game about this. Macron certainly tries to, but it sells weapons to Egypt and other countries. The Germany as well, it talks a big game. Merkel is a great proponent of democracy, but she makes a deal with the Russians because they need gas, and they make a deal with the Turks because they want to prevent the refugee crisis. So, I think it's easy for as an analyst to see that there's a lot of hypocrisy there. But, in essence, we are still a better system. And I think the world and people want this, but we need to work on ensuring it and nurturing it here at home.
30 to Chad, 30 to MRC.
Yes. And as we've lived through this very imperfect pandemic lockdown, every part of it has encouraged me about small d democracy. We've developed a whole new social license about masks, about distance. The federal government has not had to implement the Emergencies Act yet and deprive us of our liberties. And as we navigate this really imperfect, full of contradictions, goofy response, we're doing it together and we're doing it according to democratic norms. And our leaders are terrifically scared of falling out of line with their citizens. That's democracy.
Last word to the Toronto Star.
Well, I think that's democracy is exactly right, Chad. That just because you have a good process doesn't mean you're going to get a great outcome every time. There are all kinds of examples of democracy giving us bad governments. That doesn't mean we can't still have faith in a system that helps us get rid of those bad governments and give us a transition to power. Just briefly, though, we have to be careful about the rise of authoritarian populism again. But don't lose heart because it's cyclical. We've had it before and we'll have it again. And the challenge is to try to deal with it and get rid of it over and over again.
I want to thank all four of you for participating in our Democracy Agenda series with the Toronto Star, Martin Regg, Cohn, Bessma Momani, Lucan, Chad Rogers. Great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Stay safe out there, everybody, and I look forward to talking to you again.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.